So I'm going to go ahead and get started and have Sean take the floor.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Autumn. I appreciate it. So I'm Sean Metcalf, founder and CTO at Trimarc. We perform security assessments of Active Directory, Azure AD, now Entra ID. Um, I've been working in this space for well over 20 years, pretty much since Active Directory came out. And so happy to talk to all of you about some of the challenges that I've seen in assessments, as well as some reasons for these challenges. And I'll pass it over to James.
Hey, thanks y'all for joining. I'm the sales lead at Clarity, but I've definitely been involved in the technical side of the IGA market, particularly the cloud side of it since the very beginning. And I'm really looking forward to digging into the subject today because I think it's just as relevant now as it has been for 10 or 20 years. AD continues to sprawl across organizations, and let's talk about why.
So let's talk a little bit about how this happens and what we mean by Active Directory sprawl. There's a number of reasons and purposes behind it. One situation or scenario that would represent AD sprawl is when you have multiple Active Directory forests. We have one Active Directory forest that is the primary one where we have users and computers and we have applications associated with it. And then another one is brought on board because we need to be able to do testing. So now we have two Active Directory forests. We do testing in one, and then we have our production forest where we actually implement those changes. And then maybe we have a DMZ or DMZ as it's referred to overseas in that environment. And we need to ensure that there's proper access involved with that. So we create a trust between those two forests, and now we have three. There also is AD sprawl when we talk about applications, when we talk about all of these systems that can leverage Active Directory without the AD team even knowing about it, because all they need to do is join the server to the domain within the Active Directory forest, and then they can leverage the capabilities of it. And that's what's wonderful about AD. The challenge is that when you already have a large number when you already have Active Directory forests, and things are being brought up in a new Active Directory forest in order to support them, we end up in scenarios where we have more than can be supported. We have systems even in an existing production forest where we have service accounts that aren't getting their passwords changed. We have other applications that are just connected to AD, but nothing else is done with that. We have a number of different systems and permissions and things that are set up in that environment. We also have federation that broadens that area out. We have trust between these Active Directory forests. We could have multiple Active Directory domains in the same forest, which is another instance of sprawl. And we can also have forests that are added to the environment through acquisitions. So as we see on the screen right now, that weak initial controls allow unchecked growth. So how do these things happen? Because they're enabled and able to because of the technology that's at play, or because there isn't a policy that causes this to or protects this from happening. And as we see on the screen, and in certain organizations, the sprawl becomes a lasting challenge. It becomes something that we do today, and it affects us later. Next slide, please.
And I think the risks, I think, to your point, Sean, when you think about the acquisitions and you think about just the internal infrastructure of creating your production and your tests and your development for us, right? Every time you do an acquisition, you don't have three, now you have six. And over time, those kinds of things accumulate, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So where do you see the biggest risk in AD sprawl?
From what we've seen, nested groups is a really big problem. One group that's inside of another group that's inside of another group. It gets very difficult to enumerate the membership of those groups. It can be pretty simple if you have just a group, so call it Group B, that's nested in Group A. That could be fairly simple. Where we end up with problems is when you have Group B nested in Group A, but then you also have Group C nested in Group B and in Group A. And then if your code or your script that you have that enumerates this or whatever code you use to enumerate it doesn't handle looping well, then you end up in the situation where it's constantly just forever looping and trying to break out and identify what those groups are and what accounts that are in it. We see regularly in our Active Directory security assessments at Trimarc nested groups where we have something like domain admins, and there's groups that are in domain admins or groups in the domain administrators group. And before you know it, when someone looks to see who the membership is in the administrators group at the domain level, they see that there's only 5 accounts, but there's a group in there. So there's 6 total members of it. But is that true? No, it's not, because when you enumerate the membership of that group, you end up noticing that there's another 20 that aren't accounted for.
And when you think about those nested groups and how when you're spanning forests using foreign security principles, those trusts between domains, right? How does that really impact things? Doesn't that just make it worse?
It does make it worse, because when you have that foreign security principle, basically that stub account in Active Directory, in that Active Directory forest that's pointing to another object in another forest, it isn't a simple thing to identify what that account is. Or is it a single account? Is it another security group? Is it a computer account? What is it? And how is that used? And when you have this trust between these two Active Directory forests, if they're not trusted at the same level, then you're introducing additional risk by having that trust, but also having those permissions that are connected across that trust to those Active Directory forests.
Yeah, I think some of that. I talked to a company, and maybe you've talked to a few more than me, I think. They had an Active Directory environment that they inherited. So it wasn't even their fault. They were the new guy. And apparently the prior lead had thought that domain admin was just the permission you needed to be able to do things within Active Directory. And so where they were left is a lot of their underlying infrastructure was now tied to this concept that basically everyone's a domain admin, and they were trying to unwind that. So I
Yeah,
could see
that's
that
definitely a
adding
challenge.
a lot of cost and a lot of complexity, or even just, it's kind of back to that weak initial controls, right? If you don't have a good pattern, if you don't have good policies up front, then everything you do after that is undermined.
Absolutely.
So where would you see the risks of kind of the downstream permissions? Like if you don't monitor what's flowing from Active Directory?
Absolutely. So there's a lot of challenges and problems with permissions in Active Directory, just because of the way that it's been conditioned, and applications have certain requirements. So they've been set for permissions, and either permissions on the computer object, but mostly permissions that are associated with the service account for that application. As you mentioned, domain admins tends to be the thing that is the requirement. That happens a lot with applications, especially in Active Directory, where it needs domain admin because the vendor says that it does, but ultimately it doesn't need domain admins. That is the solution, not the requirement. Whenever we have a requirement that is a solution, we need to push back on it and look at it from the perspective of what is actually needed for this to work. And is that these 5 permissions, or is it really and truly domain admins? Most of the time, it's not domain admins, or we need to challenge what the actual scenario is in order to ensure that we're looking at it from the right perspective. But there are permissions that just kind of spiderweb within Active Directory, and over time, it gets difficult to identify what are those permissions actually for. When you have an Active Directory forest that's been around for 20 years, are there still people there that understand and remember why that was configured that way? Or if it's getting configured today, who's going to be able to track that in the future? Is there documentation behind why it needs those rights? Probably not.
And I thought it was interesting. We were at the Hybrid Identity Conference in New Orleans a few weeks back, and there was a presentation on effectively escalating rights through Active Directory. If you have one permission in one account and another permission in another application, you can chain permissions between applications to get more and more access. And so that seems like it would also create risk.
Absolutely. There's certain applications in Active Directory that are very risky, and the use of these is something that happens a lot for those application requirements. If an application has a service account that's over permissioned, and its password is 5 years old, 10 years old, 15 years old, which is the common scenario based on what we've seen in assessments, then yeah, there is a lot of risk to that escalation potentially by compromising that account itself.
So what else, any other kind of risks or impact, or maybe we'll jump into kind of what should everyone be asking their teams?
Absolutely. So the key is nested groups, these permissions in Active Directory, and over permissioning. We see over permissioning and over provisioning creates this risk. Over permissioning by setting those permissions higher than what they need to be, but over provisioning is provisioning those rights because it's expected or thought that maybe they need those rights, or even worse, is doing that because it's easier to make it work.
Yeah, everyone just wants to be able to solve and close the IT ticket, right? Somebody's
Yeah.
upset, they need to be able to do their job, and you don't want to be in the way. That's certainly never a fun place to be.
Correct.
So Autumn, maybe next slide, and let's get into some of the questions. So we sat down and we're thinking through, kind of what are the key questions that you should take back to your teams in terms of, if you were to address this risk, if you were to acknowledge that, maybe your AD has a little bit more permissions in it, maybe it has more groups than it should have. Where would you start, and what would the questions you would ask be? And so, Sean, maybe you could jump into, from an entitlement standpoint, when you think about how many entitlements are currently active, like why is that the place? Why is that the question that we should start with?
Well, certainly the perspective that Trimarc looks at this from an entitlement perspective is what are the accounts that have domain admin rights? What are the accounts that have administrative rights at the domain level, at the enterprise level, at the forest level? What are those accounts? How are they configured? What are the permissions that are configured in the environments? Which is the next question here. How does this all tie together? Are there ways that if having one level of rights in the environment, does that provide escalation to something else? If so, then that's something that is concerning that needs to be looked at for sure.
And then when you think about like, okay, great, I understand how many entitlements are currently active, then I guess what level of nested access is a very intuitive next step, right? How is that all structured?
What we look at is we first look at those service counts that are configured, that are very highly privileged and configured as highly privileged in the environment, ensuring that those service counts have the correct access. And if they don't, how can those be reduced down to lower levels of access that are not domain admins, for example? That's sort of the key to it, looking at it as service counts, and then there's admin accounts, and then there's two different types of admin accounts that we look at. One is the one that's associated with a person, a specific person, and the other are the sort of a generic ones that are shared. And looking at those different types of accounts and how they're configured in the environment, certainly at the group permissioning through their group nesting or through their group that they're associated with, identifying what those are and how they're configured in the environment is how we usually look at it.
But you need to go one step past that, right? Because if you're using like SQL Server for any homegrown applications you have internally, it's really common to take Active Directory groups and tie them to roles or permissions within those homegrown applications. So how would you recommend going the next step down?
That is the huge challenge. That is the biggest challenge in Active Directory that there is because if I'm a server admin, I can go ahead and create a group. And then outside of Active Directory, you mentioned Exchange, or sorry, SQL is what you mentioned.
Yeah.
So you mentioned SQL. That group that was created called SQL Server Admin Group could go ahead and be configured within the SQL application to have full admin rights to it. And no one in Active Directory would know that unless they had an idea of how it was configured. Again, that comes down to documentation. It's the same thing with Exchange. You could go ahead and create a group and then configure the permissions associated with that group in Exchange. Same thing in SharePoint. Same thing in most applications. That entitlement to that application that connects that group to it is something that you cannot natively in Active Directory determine or even figure out. You can go through and search for groups that have SQL and admin in the name and go, all right, well, these are probably my SQL admins in the environment. That's one way to do it, but that's not giving you the full picture.
Yeah, it's basically relying on naming conventions.
Correct.
Right.
And
so
then we look at nested permissions and how those are configured. Um, when we talk about nested permissions, we're ultimately looking at that same sort of thing where we have a permission associated in Active Directory with a group, but then that group could also have permissions in another application like SQL.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think, a lot of the complexity comes from the way the AD groups, being as powerful and as flexible as they are, can include resources and people and other groups and other domains and kind of just the various entities that can be grouped together. Because then those relationships get really hard to unwind because you have to know what every single thing is.
Absolutely.
So then I think another question would be, everyone has the day job, they're responding to the tickets, they're adding new applications, they're growing the business. How do you get leadership's buy-in to slow down AD sprawl? Like what are the questions that you should ask your leadership or even your teams of like, hey, what are the strategies? What are the approaches for that?
I think the first step is to perform some sort of inventory of the assets. What do we have? How many SQL servers do we have? How many Exchange servers do we have? How many SharePoint servers do we have? How many of these different application servers do we have? And then from there we can identify, all right, these are the applications that we have in the environment that are leveraging Active Directory. What is the best way for us to actually actively manage those? What documentation do we have? Is it documented in across them in some central location, or is it just each team kind of manages it because they know that's how it's being managed? So we can start with inventory management. We can or an asset management and inventory. Then we can go towards the documentation of it, and then we can start working and chipping away at these challenges where we can ensure that we understand how is the sprawl occurring. Is it multiple forests? Is it multiple domains? Is it a bunch of applications that are now using Active Directory that we might not have known about? Asking these questions of the teams and collecting that information so we have data and evidence behind it, I think is an excellent way to start this conversation with leadership, is to have this information at the fingerprints or at your fingertips, because the leadership is going to ask the question, how big of an issue is this? What sort of priority do we need to make this?
So, I mean, if I were to take a step back, kind of what you're saying is, do you really know what's in your environment? Do
Right.
you have a strong awareness of all of the moving parts? And then at that point, once you know where you are, you can start adjusting and changing. But if you don't even know where you are, it's really difficult to do anything.
Absolutely.
Okay. So I think that's a good intro for kind of what should everyone be doing. So when I think about, security in general, and I think particularly for all of you on the webinar today, there's almost a dual mandate, right? Everyone in IT and security has to protect the business. There's like the core job of security and security best practices, because as we all know, there's a million people trying to get access to your systems and your data and your sensitive information. And AI just makes it worse. There's more attacks coming now than ever. There's also the governance. So like security is kind of where you are today. And then governance is how do you manage things over time? And every IT team has some level of governance. The thing you needed yesterday isn't necessarily the thing you need today. And there needs to be some kind of continuous process where you're looking back and saying, hey, what is it that I need to protect my business today that I didn't need yesterday, or vice versa? What are the things that I don't need today that I did need yesterday to protect the business? And so I think it's really interesting that dual mandate, they're not, and I'm super interested in your opinion here, Sean, because I don't think that those are really in conflict. I think actually, if you're good at governance, you're better at security. If you're good at security, you're better at governance, because the two projects overlap so much. What's your take?
I think so. I mean, security is the thing that is necessary in order to ensure appropriate access is happening by those authorized users that we're aware of. Governance is ensuring that the appropriate methodology is applied to how those to how those entitlements are occurring, how the access is provided, how someone is able to have access one day and maybe they don't have it another day. I think it's very much of the security is kind of the why and governance is kind of the how.
Yeah. So maybe walk us through, some of the security best practices, right? Again, knowing that we're talking about AD sprawl today, there's obviously lots more in security, but identity is one of those top five things. AD is kind of a crown in the jewel, or a jewel in the crown. How's that?
Absolutely. Well, there's a few of these, and if we're boiling them down to just a handful of them, obviously there's a whole lot more. But starting with authentication, so length is strength when it comes to passwords. But really, if you read NIST guidance, if you read Microsoft guidance, the first kind of part of that is ensuring that users aren't able to use bad passwords in the first place. And if they are using passwords, we need a second factor, a multi-factor authentication associated with it. So that way we can ensure that it's the user who we expect is authenticating is the one actually authenticating. Passwordless is best. It's a little bit of a high watermark kind of to get to, but it is something that is starting to be deployed in organizations. So certainly, as we're discussing this today in 2024, we need to look towards the future and how to get there from where we are now. And one of the important ways to get there is disabling these legacy protocols. There's a lot of systems out there that can't speak SMB or NTLM v2. They need to be looked at, they need to be evaluated. And maybe if we're in the situation where there's multiple forests, one forest is sort of your compatible forest, which is still running older protocols because we can't just move those up because it has to run on 2003 or it has to run on Windows XP or something like that. So therefore, we move that into a compatible forest. And then our standard forest, our production forest, is the one where you kind of have to be this high to ride and have to have the support of protocols in order to move forward. But NTLM we can't get rid of today, but Microsoft has at least lined out the future of how we can get to Kerberos only, which is going to help tremendously. And then looking at account tiering. So Microsoft has deprecated that whole concept of how to do a red forest, how to do an admin forest. But we still have some lessons learned from that we can apply today. Implementing account tiering, certainly at level 0 or tier 0, where we have enterprise admins, domain admins, the domain administrators, those groups and accounts and the accounts associated with those need to be protected at a very high level. So that way, if someone is accessing multiple systems in the environment, they're not going to get access to a credential that is a tier 0 credential, is a domain admin credential. And then finally, looking at it and evaluating AD trusts. Are they still required? Are these forests that we have that are connected through a trust, is it required? We talked about M&A a little bit earlier. Through mergers and acquisitions, we can end up with multiple Active Directory forests that are all connected via trust because that's what leadership said should be done. I challenge that statement, and I challenge whenever someone says that we have to create a trust between it. The trust should be documented. The reasoning and business requirements behind that trust need to be documented. And they should be reviewed every year to ensure that that trust is still required, that business justification is still valid. And as soon as it's not valid, no longer needed, that trust should be removed because it is just a way to expand the authentication beyond that single forest into another forest. And if they're not the same security levels or security of those forests, where one is a very high security forest, which is, has none is compatible for older protocols, and the other one does have a higher level of protection, then you're just reducing the level of protection and capability for across all those that are involved in that trust configuration. So both of those forests would then be that one forest would actually be vulnerable because of that configuration.
I mean, it's almost like mixing tiers, right?
Yes.
So, taking a step back to like, hey, the first question is, do you know what your infrastructure looks like? When I look at these security best practices, it's then taking that and knowing where you are, but have you cataloged your inventory of access against your account tiers And then are you protecting yourself from mixing and matching different tiers of access through those trusts and nested relationships?
Right.
Interesting. And so like when you talk about improving your authentication methods, obviously Active Directory environments, you're going to be leveraging ADFS and the Entra IDP. Any other recommendations around passwordless or getting to MFA kind of approaches there?
Not in a short webcast, unfortunately
Okay.
not. Those are much bigger topics, which maybe could be explored later. But enforcing strong MFA, I mean, there are solutions out there like that Microsoft has provided. Passwordless is FIDO2. That's really where we want to get to. So working towards that is kind of the gold standard.
Awesome. So now let's spend a minute talking about how governance can help improve all those security controls and really think about, the same things, but applying the governance policies to the same concepts, right? So we've talked a lot about making sure you know what your access looks like, particularly across those nested and federated points of access. And that becomes step one to your governance process, right? Because you're going to look at what is my access today, and then you're going to look at that same thing 3 months from now. And ideally, in an ideal world, you've deleted things that you don't need. And so that access review process, instead of it being kind of the burden that no one wants to do, is the continuous enforcement of security best practice, where you're putting time on the calendar to make you do the thing that will improve your long-term security so that you don't accumulate that sprawl over time.
Right.
And I think, taking it up that tier 0 and tier 1 access, even more importantly, that privileged in those service accounts, going through that same exercise, we found through many of our deployments that the number of stale service accounts is just legion. I've seen data out there, 60 to 70% of all service accounts were used once and then forgotten. Some developer solved a problem and then went on with their life, but that access remains forever and that risk is then forever.
Right.
And so when you think about that governance process of being able to separate your accounts from a security standpoint, then reviewing that tiering, is this still tier 1 or is this now something else? Is this still required access? Is the service account still in use? I talked to another customer yesterday, actually, at the Gartner IAM conference, and she mentioned that a lot of their service accounts, they had actually gone through the exercise of just preemptively turning things off. And they just took the hit with their leadership support of, hey, I don't actually see any use for this. And so let's just test. And they went through a process of turning things off. They had the benefit of switching MFA providers. So they were using that as the lever of touching every account to switch MFA systems. But those are the kinds of things that from a governance best practice, right? You just want to review this every few minutes. And then you want to limit excessive entitlements and nested access, right? When you look at that nesting, when you look at those groups and federation, from a clean governance standpoint, you want to limit those nested entitlements. You want to limit that access because that's a huge source of over provisioning. Because as soon as you nest a group, everyone gets access to that group. And by the second or third level down, you're creating lots of access that you may not appreciate later, particularly when someone 2, 3, 4 years down the line adds a new group to an existing group, thinking everything's totally copacetic, not realizing the true access that they're creating. So we've seen examples where customers are giving their entire support team access to all of the distribution lists or misconfigured groups that create many more domain admins that are expected, things like that. Again, spanning, violating the account tiering, access tiering model and making sure that everything stays at the same level.
Yeah, and I think there's one thing that you said there that really makes a lot of sense around service counts. Service counts are the ones that no one wants to mess with, no one wants to update, no one wants to touch. And disabling them proactively to figure out what are they actually being used for is a very common method, because without the documentation around what the service account is doing, you've got to figure it out. I have a statement that I use a lot, which is if you have a service account and you're not sure what it does, but it's associated with an application, and if removing it from domain admin or disabling it is going to cause a problem to your service, to that application, then is that application truly supported? How can it be supported if you're not familiar with all the pieces, what access they actually need and how it's being used? We talk with cyber liability insurance companies, and they say that the number one reason how attackers get access is through a service account. So these service accounts are very vulnerable. They're the most vulnerable in many organizations. We see the same thing where they have passwords that are very old and they're not really touched. No one wants to mess with them. But these are the things that enable attackers the capability in these environments the majority of the time. And we hear that from breaches. So yeah, it's very important to focus on service accounts and ultimately ensure that they have the rights that they need and nothing more than that.
So Sean, I'll let you go first in terms of, how can Trimarc help with helping companies control AD sprawl?
Certainly. So we have a security assessment that is very comprehensive. This is actually one of the the items that we get most regularly from our customers. It is incredibly comprehensive. It's incredibly in-depth. It covers all the things that really matter from an Active Directory security assessment and a security standpoint. We identify problems with service accounts when we provide real guidance on how to fix those, and not just here's the priority, but also here's the approximate level of effort of how to fix that. So we effectively provide a guided roadmap of how to fix these items and get these things resolved. We never deliver the same report twice because our customers are able to fix things because of how we do it and our methodology. Um, from an Azure AD perspective, we are looking at and have an assessment dedicated to Azure AD, Entra ID. Same sort of thing, very in-depth, very comprehensive. And we also have our new Vision product that is going to be launching in the new year, which is currently in early access. If you want to talk about that, feel free to reach out at trimarcvision.com. Vision looks at those most important security issues and proactively provides information about what the issues are, how those things can be resolved, and can actually help you plan that out through our remediation planner that's built into Vision itself.
Yeah, and Sean, I don't know if I told you this, but I was at the HIP conference at a lunch and I overheard a group of people talking about Trimarc and your services. And so I want to give a shout out to Jake Hildreth because apparently he's amazing on your team. And I know you got a bunch of amazing people, but it's not often that you have a security researcher on a team like yours that is getting, named mentions from just attendees of a random conference.
That's great. Thank you.
And, for those of you who are interested in how Clarity can help, would love to book a personalized demo. We've just recently released a nested access graph that allows you to connect your material applications from a CMDB to the servers that host them and the 80 groups that allow access to those servers so that you can do full chain of trust from Active Directory, all nested groups downstream, your material applications and servers. And it's all a really nice visual where you can drill into each of those individual groups and who's a member of those groups. Active Directory being the focus of this webinar, it also works for other systems like Google or Oracle or AWS. So we'd love to show you how we can help on the governance side. And I'm sure Trimarc would love to hear you on how they can help on the security side. And this has been a fantastic webinar, Sean. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sean and James. We will have our recording available tomorrow, and that will be sent out to all registered attendees. And just thank you guys for taking the time to stop in today.
Absolutely. Thanks for the invite.
Thanks, y'all. Bye.
Bye, guys.